Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for the Good Systems Speaker Series. I'm excited to introduce you to our host for today's event. But before we get started, I'd like to give you a little bit of background on Good Systems. If you're not already familiar with us, we are a UT Austin Research Grand Challenge focused on designing ethical AI technologies for the benefit of society. We're a team of about 150 researchers working across more than 30 different disciplines here on campus. And we also collaborate with partners in industry, nonprofit, and government in our work. And we host this speaker series on a regular basis to bring in diverse perspectives on ethical AI. Today, and without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to our host, Dr. Junfeng Zhao. Dr. Zhao is an associate professor of community and regional planning at the UT Austin School of Architecture. He's the director of the Urban Information Lab, director of the Texas Smart Cities Consortium, and a founding member and past chair of Good Systems. He leads one of our core research projects, A Good System for Smart Cities. And Dr. Zhao, I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
Thank you very much, Stacy, and welcome, James, and welcome, everyone. My name is Junfeng. As Stacy mentioned, I lead the Good System Smart City research track. Basically, we apply ethical AI technology in all fields of smart city. Currently, we have 3 different domains. One is a digital twin. And second one is housing and transportation simulation. The third one is GPT. We actually did design our large language model based on open source data. But today is not my talk. Let me introduce our great honor lecturer person, James Hudson. James is the CEO of the AI for Good Foundation. James is responsible for building economic and community resilience through technology. Since 2015, the AI for Good Foundation has worked with national and municipal governments, the UN, OECD, and many others to design, develop, and deploy tech-enabled policy and solutions for social, economic, and institutional transformation. AI for Good works intensively in Ukraine with more than 40 staffs on the ground and strategically partnership with Ukraine's President Administration, Minister for Digital Transformation, Minister for Culture, and regional governments, providing sections, recommendations, infrastructure resilience, deploy technology, expertise, and real-time aids for the region, covering more than 8 million civilians. James completed a doctorate degree in AI as a Marie Curie Fellow at Joseph Stefan Institute in Slovenia, holding an undergraduate degree in CS and philosophy from Princeton, and previously funded and led the AI research group at Bloomberg in New York from 2012 to 2015. His academic work spans complex network analysis, natural language processing, labor economics, corporate finance, and accounting, as well as holding multiple AI patents and being an active angel investor in the tech for good space. Without further ado, I will turn the floor to James.
Thank you, Junfeng. It's an honor to be here, to be able to talk with you today about the work that we're doing and also see the synergies between what Good Systems is doing at UT Austin and kind of all the multidisciplinary work that's happening there. I want to start by telling you a little bit about my own links to UT Austin, just to make things a little bit more personal. So about 11 years ago or so, when I was running the AI research division at Bloomberg in New York, I had the pleasure of setting up strategic research relationships with a number of universities across the US, and UT Austin was among the first 3 or 4 of these universities. And actually, at that time, we had a lot of hiring out of the PhD program in CS and information systems. And I had the pleasure of visiting UT Austin on a regular basis to discuss with faculty research that we're doing that we were doing, and also lots of grants that that we were putting out at the time. So actually, it's nice to be back virtually in some sense, and I do definitely look forward to engaging more with this group. Now, over the next 45 minutes, hour or so, I'm not going to do a formal lecture, right? I don't have slides for you. I want to make this more of a conversation, which means, I encourage you to engage with me. I encourage you to ask questions, unmute yourself, feel free to have your video on if you want, wave at me, signal at me, whatever you want to do. But let's try to make this an active conversation, because, I think that, and I say this, I was at the UN last week in New York, and a lot of these conversations about the role of AI in society are one way, right? They're people, whether it's like people like me, or researchers, or policymakers, or heads of White House committees, giving talks about their view on this section, on this kind of area of technology and society. But the reality is that these interactions have to be conversations, and what better way to start conversations than among kind of research-focused people from all these different disciplines. And it's actually how AI for Good started as well, right? So in 2013, actually, so a couple of years before we formally created the organization, we had a series of workshops that we ran at Stanford in order to understand the direction in which artificial intelligence or machine learning or statistical inference and the related disciplines research was going over the coming 10-15 years, and to think about what we needed as a community, what we needed to push towards, what were the missing pieces, and how to get there. And a few of the conclusions that came out of those meetings, it was about 25 of us over 3 days in a closed door setting. And two of the big things that came out were inclusivity in the kind of AI research community. And how do we get more stakeholders engaged in CS and machine learning and related disciplines? And the other side was, how do we get more of the research community applying their work empirically in situations that are beneficial to society? Now, at that time, the biggest blockers were funding trends. So lots of funding for university research coming from corporate sponsors, right? This was right after the Netflix prize. It was around the time that IBM Watson was being shown off. And a lot of the research community's focus was on big corporate challenges, right? Whether it be ad optimization in Google or recommender systems, the start of ImageNet, but again, a lot of the ImageNet research that was coming out, the empirical tests were being done for more corporate type challenges. And we wanted to find ways in which we could bridge the work of the research community and, for lack of a better word, social good. And so the AI for Good Foundation actually was created out of this need to build bridges to the policymaking community, the civil society movement, the kind of social technology movement. And that meant across not only national governments, but also talking to communities themselves, right? Municipal governments, but also stakeholders in local communities to figure out what are the big trends and challenges that we need to be facing, and where technology in general can have an impact. Now, that's the genesis of AI for Good, but today we work in many ways that are specific and under a framework that's evolved over the last 7-8 years. Specifically, our mission, as Junfeng pointed out, is economic and community resilience through technology. And I want to focus on those two words, community, right, which means really understanding the needs of human beings, and economic, which means identifying and building the right incentive structures so that people's behavior and the outcomes are aligned with our intentions. So I don't mean economic in the sense of finance, right? I mean economic in the sense of how we manage resources in society in order to achieve the outcomes that we want to achieve. And I don't mean community in a generic sense. I mean community in the sense of really allowing people to have a voice and to have a way of expressing their own circumstances and the resources that they need in order to be successful, in order to have lead better lives and have the support that they need in order to do that. We do that work through 3 primary verticals. Right? The first vertical we call intelligent societies, which is what I chose to use as the title for today's talk. Intelligent societies is where we put all of our projects that are with national governments, regional governments, cities, and stakeholder communities, right, that might be cross-cutting. So, for example, we've worked very closely over the years with OECD in order to craft the principles for responsible AI, an understanding of artificial intelligence from a policy-making perspective. And the same has trickled into work with the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the US, the Commission for AI in the UK, national level AI initiatives within various European countries, as well as what I would say was our biggest work in this area so far. And I'll talk a little bit more about this also today, which was the establishing and deployment of a national AI strategy for Ethiopia, among other countries, but Ethiopia is the largest country where we've done this, which is 120 million people. It's also a country where the types of challenges that you might come up against when thinking about artificial intelligence are different, right, from more advanced economies, for instance. And that's why I want to delve a little bit into Ethiopia as kind of one of our case studies for today. The second area where we focus a lot of our efforts, we call catalyzing innovation. So catalyzing innovation means creating the conditions within communities for them to be able to attack the challenges that they see, to marshal the resources, and to be able to innovate from within, right? So there is a tendency in kind of the technology for society movement to think about solutions that go across, global communities, right? So top-down approach to solutions. And we see empowerment of the local community as being a much larger driver for change over the long term than seeking universal climate change solutions or universal solutions to public finance or governmental e-government type approaches. We want local stakeholders to feel engaged, and we want to build the capacity for innovation from the ground up, because building that capacity from the ground up will create more productivity at the local level. It will create more economic opportunity at the local level, and it will address problems that are multifaceted and not necessarily the same as are encountered in other communities. And so we do that, again, through engagement with the communities. We do it by establishing incubator programs, training programs, helping startups to find their feet in local communities, and also helping local governments to feed that engine in an appropriate way. Now, the last tranche of our work is the newest tranche also, and it's something I'll delve into towards the end of our time today. And that's what we call humanitarian aid 2.0. Humanitarian aid 2.0 is basically came out of the recognition that the technologies that are used for crisis response are not very sophisticated. The impact measurement within the nonprofit community is, although a big topic, it's done in a less than ideal way and a less than accurate way. And that in order to really have an impact, we need to empower communities to respond to crises in an adaptive and specific way to their, depending upon their needs. So a lot of the work that we've done has focused on Ukraine because Ukraine was an emerging crisis where we saw and where we had the ability to track, if you will, and respond to the frictions that were emerging on the ground. And so since February of 2022, we've grown a lot of programs within the country, which, as Junfeng mentioned, we now have around 40 or so full-time staff based within Ukraine across Kharkiv, Kiev, Odessa, Sumy, and Lviv regions. And that allows us to pilot programs within Ukraine that we hope will become examples of how technology can be used and deployed within society, both within crisis, but also over the longer term to help rebuild areas that have been devastated, whether it be by war, by natural disasters, or through other consequences. Now, again, I'll dive into that towards the end, but resilience in society depends upon an understanding of the frictions that exist, the weaknesses that exist, and the incentives that exist. You cannot solve the issues that we see without having a deep understanding of why the situation is as it is at that moment in time in that community. And so when we talk about bridging technology into the community, it has to be done with that kind of engagement in mind. Okay, so talking about intelligent societies, right? So how is it that we actually engage with communities when we're doing our work? Right? We're a US-based nonprofit. We have partnerships with governments at the national, regional, and local level. But how does it work in practice when we're actually building out those partnerships and deploying? So we will generally send a team of economists, team of technologists, a team of analysts to the areas where we are working. So those teams will actually meet with government representatives, they will meet with civil society representatives, they will meet with community representatives, and they will gather a lot of the requirements, if you will, around what frictions are being observed within that society, and how different stakeholder groups are talking about those issues, how they prioritize those issues. And this also falls very much into questions about budgeting, right? How is public funding happening in these areas, right? The dynamics of spending within both the municipal and kind of the local contexts. That means also interacting with building, urban planning. It means understanding how different levels of government interact within these areas. And it's not until we've built a fairly deep understanding of the systems that are already in place, the institutional forms that are in place across the area of interest, that we start to build an intervention map and a roadmap of how we can intervene within an area in order to solve some of the issues that have been identified. So to take Ethiopia as a case study example, within Ethiopia, which is a large, diverse country, both environmentally and demographically, of about 120 million people, there are several big frictions that emerge. One is access to infrastructure, right? So it's a country where one large city, Addis Ababa, the capital city, has access to a lot of infrastructure and a lot of spending on infrastructure development. And that includes electrification infrastructure, it includes sewage and kind of basic infrastructure of that kind, and it includes also telecommunications infrastructure. More than 80% of Ethiopia's bandwidth is within that one single capital city. Now, as you start to dig into it a little bit more, you also notice things like road networks being planned very centrally. So all roads go through Addis. All railways go through Addis. All lines of the electrical grid are centered on Addis, despite the fact that most of the generative capacity comes from the west of the country. You also, when you start to look into current political dynamics in Ethiopia, there were, at the time when we were working, increased tensions between the Tigray community in the north of the country and the government, which was a non-Tigray government at the time. And working with ministerial staff and the ministers themselves from the central government, we realized very early on in our interactions that we were not getting the stakeholder feedback that we needed from the whole country. We were getting very much a capital city focused response. And this was one of the main political issues that we realized during our project there, which was that we needed to find a way to democratize access or democratize the voices that we were listening to within the country in order to really understand the developmental priorities for the country. So a few patterns emerged. One was access to infrastructure, and access to infrastructure in rural areas was preventing rollout of education to kind of end nodes in the system, villages, smaller towns. Access to electricity and communication was preventing healthcare data from making it to areas where it could be analyzed. Also, that access was preventing a lot of kind of local civil engagement from happening, because a lot of the political will and political decisions were being made outside of the context and then funneled into the regional governments. On the education side, we were seeing that in the city, more than 80% of children would go to school at least until 12 years old. In the villages, that was less than 20% of children. So you start to build a map of the needs of a country, right, by region, by demographic splits, and also by infrastructure availability, that shows you what might be some of the priority areas that need to be addressed. Right? So clearly, right, there's a whole aspect of this which comes down to basic economic development. Right? How do we ensure that when money is spent on electrifying the country, that it is spent in a way that brings the most people the benefit of electricity, which is not AI, right? Same thing for internet, right? How do we get people to be more connected? Now, often when we talk in the US about getting people access to technology and making sure that communities feel more engaged in how technology is affecting their local area. We consider communication and kind of access to those systems as a given. But even in the US, there are huge pockets of the population that have very restricted access to the internet and even to sufficient electricity to promote economic development. And so we have to remember when we're talking about artificial intelligence that we're looking at it through a very unbalanced lens, right? Especially, you know, as an organization that operates out of the Bay Area here in California, it's very easy to fall into a trap of thinking that advancements in large-scale generative language models is inevitably going to have a massive impact on the way people view and use technology around the world. The reality is that the channels for technology to be able to do that in many places do not exist. And so there is no talking about AI in society without talking about the basic infrastructure systems that deliver the ability to interact with these systems. And as a result, a lot of our work as an organization really looks at how we can most effectively provide incentives to governments and to local communities to solve those problems first. Now, how do we do that in Ethiopia? Well, I can't really claim to have solved the problem in Ethiopia because halfway through our project with the Ethiopian government and our partners in the region, there was essentially a civil war, which went on for around 18 months and disrupted a lot of the work that we had started with the local government, including kind of increased development around electrical infrastructure. But what I will say is that the Ethiopian government was spending a lot of money on building what's known as the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. So anybody from well, I'm sure there are a lot of people on this call who are very well familiar with the geopolitical consequences of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which was essentially something that Egypt was very much against because Egypt relies on the Nile. And the GERD, as it's known, was basically going to reduce flows of water into the Nile by a significant amount over several years as the dam was being filled. It was also most likely going to stop a lot of very, very rich silt from reaching the Nile kind of basin and valley. So it was something that caused an enormous amount of geopolitical tension in the region. However, it's also a project that promises to fulfill the electrical needs of Ethiopia as a country, more than 90% of the capacity that would be needed over the next 10 years, plus allow Ethiopia to become a net exporter of electricity to neighboring countries. Now, obviously, neighboring countries in Ethiopia are also fairly unstable, as we're seeing right now in Sudan, for instance. But one of the main drivers of stability is actually access to infrastructure like clean energy, because clean energy and telecommunications infrastructure are highly, highly correlated with increased job creation, increased stability of local governments, and increased ability to raise funds locally, which tends to act against a lot of the community problems that are otherwise emerging. Now, through the GERD, the Ethiopian government is now building high-tech cities along the pathways from the dam into the kind of main electrical grid. Those high-tech cities are encouraging partnerships with international organizations to build data centers, to build infrastructure that allows increased technology education and jobs to be created within Ethiopia. And it has a secondary structure, which is to create to prevent, in some sense, the Ethiopian government from exploiting communication lines within the country, and the internet in particular, as a political weapon. Because now a lot of income is generated through foreign direct investment in the country, and that income is dependent upon the Ethiopian government not switching off the internet at will, which was something that they were doing much more frequently a couple of years ago. And not switching off the internet is good because it allows stability in building companies and building kind of community-led technology initiatives, as well as giving companies the peace of mind that they can continue operating. So in some sense, the bringing together of these two sides solves both the problem of economic development, right, getting people to come into the country, and the political stability element, which is getting the government to be aligned with the economic development needs of the country. Now, that has actually led to a lot of experimentation in the Ethiopian tech sector, which has been coupled with incubators, accelerator programs, and pilot programs bringing technology to more rural areas, where artificial intelligence is now part of identifying needs within local communities by actually giving people access to technologies for better agriculture development, healthcare, so telehealth. And what we're seeing is that the availability of the basic infrastructure is now pushing a lot of technology experimentation on the ground. That technology experimentation on the ground is leading to more transparency about what the problems are in communities that are far from the capital city. And it has allowed pilot programs, very effective pilot programs across the healthcare spectrum, education spectrum, urban planning spectrum, and core infrastructure spectrum within Ethiopia. So what we're seeing is the beginning of a transformation from what is essentially an agricultural country. More than 90% of employment is in the agriculture sector. And from a country whose availability of infrastructure being so low prevents basic education and healthcare services from being delivered, to a country where we can experiment with different solutions at the service endpoints, right, away from the bigger cities, and potentially act as a benchmark for other African nations that are similarly developing. So when we talk about intelligent societies as, you know, the AI for Good Foundation, really it requires that human-centric, community-driven approach, going in and understanding what are the main challenges that are being faced, which might not be technology challenges. In fact, seldom do we have, you know, problems of AI ethics being the core driving issues of challenges that we see within society. What we do see is that, in general, the imbalance in access to the resources drives a lot of the problems in then addressing whatever it might be, injustices in societies, inequity. And the balance of resource availability also inhibits economic development, inhibits economic productivity, inhibits capital flows into regions. And those are generally the principal levers that we have in terms of then pushing people to solve these problems. So from the national level, thinking kind of going down to more local level, we also work with municipalities around the world. So in particular, to take an example from nearby here, we work closely with the city of Long Beach in California. Now, the city of Long Beach is much more advanced than in terms of technology use and experimentation than the government of Ethiopia. However, many people in the Long Beach area suffer from endemic lack of access to basic technology resources that could enable them to find economic opportunity. And by that, I mean lack of access, again, to basic internet and electricity resources. Long Beach has a very large homeless population, which by definition lacks access to these resources, but they also have a fairly large transitional population that suffers from lack of targeted city-based or municipal resources to their needs. So people who are in and out of housing, people who need food pantry or other food, kind of basic food security support on a regular basis. People who have less than 20 or so hours of employment each week, and therefore cannot meet rent and therefore fall into cracks in kind of the civil infrastructure. Now, one of the things that makes Long Beach kind of an interesting case study as well is that Long Beach as a city, right, has already had a long history of experimentation with technology, right? So they have a lot of technology embedded in urban planning and the building department. There is a lot of technology embedded in local health insurance networks, right? So telehealth is not a new thing to Long Beach. However, again, when you look at who actually leverages services from the government that are digital services, you'll find that it's people who generally also have access, right, and have used services that are not from the government and provide the same access. So people with private healthcare insurance are far more likely to make use of government-based telehealth and other digital services than people without private insurance. People who are fully employed are more likely to explore and make use of government benefit programs than people who are unemployed or underemployed. People with high financial literacy are more likely to take advantage of government subsidy programs during crises like COVID than people who have less financial literacy. And this is a problem everywhere, and it's not a problem related specifically to how good technology is. But we have to remember that most of the time, and this is generally true, although again, I'd like you to challenge me on these things. But in general, what we see is that technology adoption within cities, but within really any community, tends to promote passive use of technology. So it tends to be that passive engagement increases the more technology you make available to a particular region. And what do I mean by passive engagement? Well, I mean that people who are already well versed in digital services and digital ways of accessing information will make use of these services. However, they will tend to actually depress the access to non-digital versions of those services, as well as the digital versions of those services, to people who are less digitally literate. So passive engagement looks great on paper because all of a sudden we scale, let's say, access to telehealth systems, and it's cheaper per capita to run those systems. And when people engage with them, they have better outcomes than they had before the systems were available. But the people who were marginalized before those systems were put in place tend to be even more marginalized after those systems have been put in place overall. Now, that doesn't mean that certain parts of those communities aren't being reached and that there isn't, some level of engagement, but it tends to be very lumpy. And it tends to be that those people who do not engage from the communities that were most targeted might actually end up worse off afterwards than before, especially when the focus is taken away from the solutions that were available previously in a non-digital setting. That exacerbates a lot of the issues that were being seen. So we prefer what we call active engagement of technology solutions. That means when we are developing and deploying solutions into city and municipal settings, we actually need to design with those marginalized communities as principal stakeholders, and we need to design the channels by which to engage those communities as a principal piece of the puzzle of deployment. So that means that you deploy services first to those people who are most marginalized by the current status quo. That means you focus on getting infrastructure rolled out into those places. And that means also giving people devices that they need in order to access these resources, the training that they need in order to access these resources, the capital that they need in order to be able to have the liberty to explore these resources. And that's a very different approach from, lowest hanging fruit, where we are going to give the resources to the largest community we can that is already enabled to access it. And then from there, try to go reverse into the communities that are hardest to reach. Now, the problem is if you don't do it that way, then you end up with the problem I just mentioned about passive engagement, which is if you don't do it that way, you will end up spending less on the solutions that pre-exist that are available to those marginalized communities, and you'll end up leaving them out even more than before. And that's a point, and I'm making it 3 times, that we keep seeing over and over and over again from governments that are investing heavily in digitization, because digitization for the digital ready masses is easy, right? For people who are used to having an online bank account and are using their phone for health visits and are using their tablet in order for their kids to learn remotely, right? It's easy to roll out e-government services. For people who do not have the benefit of access, it actually ends up making them worse off. And it's important that we are thinking about that at every step of the way when we're developing digital and especially AI-enabled services, where we can accelerate the rate of removal of the non-AI processes by essentially making it look like we have an all-encompassing digital layer, when in fact, we haven't done anything to address the accessibility issues. Okay, so I don't want to get too much into a discussion of AI ethics because don't really have the time, and I want to wrap up in the next few minutes. But I do want to tell you a little bit about our experience in Ukraine, because it's timely and because I think it also speaks to some of the frictions that I've been mentioning over the last half an hour, especially around technology deployment approaches and how to better measure what is needed within a social context. A lot of this also comes down to not that we don't have the technical capabilities to create better solutions, because putting aside latest developments in artificial intelligence, most of our technology for society is so basic that it can be improved upon massively without calling on, the state of the art. And in fact, if we look at most of the investments that are being made by municipalities, maybe a couple of municipalities putting aside, they are not in technologies that represent the state of the art, nor should they be necessarily in order to kind of have a big impact. Now, in Ukraine, there are a few things that we did as of February last year. One of the biggest things that we noticed early on in the crisis was that a lot of the humanitarian aid shipments that were coming into the country were essentially trucks driving in to a town square, dropping off, 100 boxes of aid, signing that they had dropped them off, taking a photograph, and driving out again. Then people would gather around, they would take the boxes, and then surprise, surprise, a few weeks later, there would be a story in the New York Times about how the humanitarian aid in Ukraine was being resold in stores. Well, to take one example, when the Red Cross shipped in 200,000 COVID masks at the very beginning of the war into the Kharkiv region, where let's just say that COVID masks were not the #1 priority. Well, what do we expect to happen, right? People are economic agents. They will take the resources that they have and they will look for ways to redistribute those resources in a way that will efficiently address the problems that they do have. The same when another organization started shipping large numbers of cases of bottles of Coca-Cola. I don't have anything against Coca-Cola, and neither do most Ukrainians, but it simply wasn't a resource that they were lacking. And what we realized was that there was a complete lack of connectivity between the available resources in a particular location and the needs of people in that location, given the circumstances. So clearly, we needed better ways in order to solicit the demand and understand the supply. We needed to understand it from a dynamic perspective of how the war was evolving. And we needed to be able to predict what things would be necessary in a particular local area. Ideally, by doing that, also putting in the hands of the local communities the ability to connect people who have a need, demand, to the available supply. Now, we also realized, and this is, I think, a very interesting point for those who maybe haven't seen how humanitarian aid works in other crisis situations over the years, but basically, when you start shipping humanitarian aid in based on a template, so based on, here is what people might need during a crisis, which is how the majority of these organizations work, you end up, whether it's from a medicine perspective or a basic supplies perspective or a clothing and food perspective, you end up undercutting the existing supply chains and retail market that is in these communities. So if you have networks of pharmacies whose supply chains were operating still fairly normally despite a war having started, right? They were able to receive deliveries. And you assume that medicine has been disrupted and you ship in a lot of free basic medicine, you essentially drive the pharmacies out of business. Pharmacies that were also able to provide free medicine to people who needed it, potentially, and that were providing specialized medicine according to the needs of the local community that the humanitarian aid organizations would never have on their lists. And so what we were seeing happening was many more pharmacies and retail stores of other kinds shutting down because of humanitarian aid that was being shipped in, undercutting their local markets. And we were also seeing, because of that, an exacerbation of certain drugs being missing because the pharmacies that would provide them, because they knew what local people needed, were no longer in business to be able to provide them. And the only medicines available were from a list of emergency medicines that are generally needed in communities during such a time. Now, along with the Office of the President in Ukraine and the Ministry for Digital Transformation, we ended up creating a series of technology and AI-enabled interventions, which we called LifeForce. And LifeForce was a way for retailers and supply chain organizations and NGOs operating in the area to manage their inventory, to understand what supply and services were available in a local region. And on the other side, for individuals, through Ukraine's e-government portal, which is called DIA, and which is available to more than 85% of adults in Ukraine, mostly because of Ukraine's policy of providing smartphones to people who didn't have them so that they could access the e-government services. But through that, allowing individuals to essentially express the needs that they have and to be immediately connected with the fulfillment of that need. So people who needed a particular medicine would be shown which pharmacy nearby them has that medicine in stock right now and isn't too dangerous for them to visit. People who needed particular baby formula for their babies would be provided with the locations where they can go immediately and get that. If they need it for free, then it assesses the need that they have and the available free supply of the item. If not, it allows the community to help them out. And if not, it allows us to purchase it in the market economy like anybody else would purchase it. And by building this system, we managed to get very detailed information about the needs and the supply in the local areas, which we're able to provide to government and NGOs in order to more precisely decide what things should be shipped in and what things should not be shipped in. Also, to predict what items are going to be in acute shortage and which items might end up exacerbating local retail problems, right? By essentially causing warehouses to be full of things that aren't going to be sold and so on. So by building this system, we were able to start creating what I would call a technology-enabled social safety net. That is where the e-government services of a country end. Usually people fall between the cracks. That's especially true in the US, which has a very, very thin e-government layer. In fact, the US hardly has any real e-government systems running. But in a country that has very sophisticated e-government systems like Ukraine, which is now being pushed to other countries also within the EU, it's important that we identify the channels, right, that allow us to help people that don't get access to the services. So, okay, I got I got the message that I need to leave time for questions, so I'm going to stop there. But hopefully, I've given you a decent overview of our approach, some case studies, and some food for thought as we engage further.
All right, thank you, James, so much for the fantastic talk. So actually, I have one question, and then probably we can open up the floor. So I think in the beginning, we were talking about the barriers to engagement with the government, and you were talking about the funding issues. So in the examples you had in the beginning about Ethiopia, so it was started from a funding source, and then you reached out to the Ethiopia government, or you reach out to the Ethiopia government, and then you look for the sources of funding?
So we always try to be funded independently of the governments that we work with. And this is in order for us to maintain autonomy in the recommendations that we make and in the technology that we build and in our deployment capacity as well. So in particular in Ethiopia, the work was funded through private foundations, but also through the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, which is based in London, and which has a great network within kind of ministerial levels across Africa. But yeah, we try to stay very independent of the final recipient of our recommendations and work.
Thank you so much. I think if there are questions, you can raise your hand or you can put it into the chat.
I guess I answered every possible question that could come up during the talk.
James, I have a quick question. So you mentioned in some developing countries, basic infrastructure is more important than AI. So my question is, in your view, how do we approach this problem if we have a limited resources to, say, deploy in a developing country? Should we just build up the infrastructure and forget about the AI, or how should we do in this kind of situation?
One thing I would say on this front is that building resilient infrastructure is not as expensive as we might think it is. Building roads is probably the most expensive type of infrastructure. And in many cases, we don't need to build the roads in order to enable a lot of new types of digital services and economic opportunity in a particular region. We do need to build alternatives to roads. If we don't have roads, that might be railways, it might be airports, you know, and so on. Because trade is still sitting at the core, right, of economic development, and we do have a very connected, kind of globalized industry. But what I would say is, taking the example of Ethiopia, right? Our current and ongoing infrastructure development for a fiber backbone for Ethiopia would cost only $150 million to basically lay fiber to every single village in Ethiopia. So fiber bundles that run basically 98% of the population of Ethiopia. That's not a lot of money, right? That's like 5% of the amount of money that the US government wants to spend on building a giant data center, which I was in Washington for a couple of weeks ago. So it's really not a lot of and the nice thing is that actually robots can lay a lot of this nowadays. So even from a labor intensity perspective, it's fairly low.
Thank you. That makes sense.
Well, we have a question from Kara in the chat. James, do you want to answer the question?
I'm just reading it. Cell phone cameras. Yeah, so there are a bunch of ongoing kind of citizen science type approaches to this problem, right? But I guess the largest network of this kind, which is not a real-time network, well, the largest two networks would be kind of what was being done with OpenStreetMaps, which they did pilot in some places, like very real-time data streams through the platform, which ended up being very unwieldy. but again, now with more modern kind of data streaming infrastructure might be easier to do. This was about 5-6 years ago. And the other side, of course, is before Waze was purchased by Google, Waze actually had some very interesting research collaborations with labs where they were using cameras from people's cell phones mounted on dashboards in order to better understand the traffic conditions. And that, of course, could lead to all kinds of enhancements in kind of smart roads initiatives and so on. An additional interesting observation, though, is that we found that in Ukraine, we were able to install about 250 kind of sensors. Sensors could be anything from a camera to an air sensor to a light sensor, right? So stuff that you can do traffic monitoring with very easily and also do plate analysis. So we could install about 250 of these across a city for under $200,000 to $300,000. So actually the baseline cost with some of these technologies, there's TV white space technology from Microsoft, for instance, for doing mesh type networks, but over larger distances, and also UHF technology like Curb from Cisco, which now allows you to do very long range sensor network type stuff where you don't need more than a few hundred megabit of bandwidth in order to draw everything together, but you can deploy them in a matter of weeks and for very little kind of money. So that might be even better than relying on networks of cell phones, for instance, depending on how critical.
Yeah, I don't think we need networks. So what we're doing here is just recording egregious behavior and pushing it to an app or a website server that infers the speed and then the plate and like a make and model and alerts the relevant enforcement agency. And so it's not for citizens to talk about how bad people are in their neighborhood or something, or somebody just ran a red light here. I don't think anybody on Waze needs to know that, but enforcement agencies need to know it. Have you met anybody doing work in this area?
Yes. Yes, I have. I actually, there was a discussion very much on this topic at kind of the National Academy of Sciences last year. And I would be happy to go back and find the names of people and send those over to you afterwards.
Thank you so much, James. I just put my email in there in case, but if you just, take a picture of my crazy last name, you'll find me easily. Thanks.
And actually, that's a good point. So if anybody does want to get in touch with me, I'm sure that the organizers can send around my email address afterwards, but just in case, I'll put it here as well so that you can reach me. Oh, sorry, that was 2 messages in one. Okay, so the Cisco thing is called Cisco Ultra Reliable Wireless Backhaul, CURWB, and my email address is hodson@aiforgood.org.
I don't think we're seeing anything. You might be directing it to one of the organizers rather than to the everyone group.
Okay, yeah, I guess that's my.
And now you can't copy and paste because it's Zoom. Sorry about that. There we go.
So I put it into the chat.
Awesome. Thanks, Arya.
And we are going to share this information after this meeting.
Great. Yeah, and I'm always available if anybody wants to reach out and chat more about any of these projects, then please do.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining. It was a great talk. Thank you, James. And see you at the next Good System seminar.
Thank you, everyone, for joining our talk. See you next time.